Hello, and welcome to the ShelterBox webinar. My name is Kerri Murray, and I serve as president of ShelterBox USA. And I want to thank all of the supporters of ShelterBox who come today to learn about our recent responses, including to the Ukraine crisis. And I also want to thank so many new people who are joining us today to come and learn about the global humanitarian work of ShelterBox. As a privately funded humanitarian organization, we can't do this without your charitable support. So thank you so much for supporting these efforts. This morning, I really want to share a bit about who we are as a global humanitarian relief organization, share with you the work of ShelterBox, as well as take you to the front lines of this conflict situation in Ukraine and introduce you to one of our senior response team leaders who's working in one of the neighboring countries leading our responses. So to get things started, I would love for this to be interactive. So please feel free throughout today's webinar to chat in your questions. And throughout the webinar, we're going to tackle some of the questions that you have. So as a global humanitarian relief organization, ShelterBox works on the front lines of crisis situations. We work in some of the world's most extreme conflict zones, as well as in disaster situations, including natural disasters. Many of you know us for our work in some massive humanitarian disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, fires, flood situations that we work in all across the world. But also the fastest growing piece of our work has been in response to violent conflict. And this is really driving global displacement in our world. So before the Ukraine crisis began, there were 114 million people displaced in our world by disaster situations and conflict. And what we know is that millions more since this crisis began are now displaced. And this is the most numbers in terms of millions of people that have been displaced in recorded history, and it's growing each and every day. As a humanitarian relief organization, ShelterBox has our roots in one of the oldest service organizations in the world, and that's Rotary International. I know many of you are Rotarians, and Rotary continues to be the tie that binds so many of our responses, particularly our natural disaster responses. Rotarians serving as volunteers on the front lines, as well as providing really sources of information to ShelterBox as well in times of crisis, including this crisis within Ukraine. So as a global humanitarian organization, we focus on one of the basic needs everyone has as a human, and that's your need for shelter. What are our basic needs? They're food, water, shelter, and access to medical care. But ShelterBox focuses really specifically on the provision of emergency shelter and basic supplies to set up household when families have been displaced. The center of gravity for what we do is the provision of shelter. And it takes many shapes, many sizes, many forms. What you're looking at here is a classic shelter box. And this is really based on the premise of what are the things that you need. So the central piece is the shelter. This is a standard relief tent. This looks like a recreation tent. It is not. It is the place that a family will call home in the aftermath of a disaster or crisis situation. And a family will live in this tent for a period of weeks to months following their displacement. In addition, the things that you think about that are essential for survival: one, clean water. So often in disaster zones, you see contamination of the water source. So we include a water purification unit, containers to store purified water. So often in these emergencies, including what you're seeing in Ukraine, you've lost power. So we include solar lanterns, essential for basic tasks and having light to work, to sleep, to go out in the middle of the night to go to use the bathroom. It's essential for safety. Also, we bring in basic things like cooking sets. So often in these situations, you see aid organizations bringing in food and water. But what are you going to boil water in? What are you going to prepare a hot meal for your family? So ShelterBox includes stainless steel cooking sets. We also include tools, basic tools to help with the repair process when your home's been damaged, as well as essential things like thermal blankets, sleeping mats, essential things to really help set up the household quickly when you've been displaced. Now, in addition to the standard shelter box, which many of you are familiar with, we've also really been pioneering the use of other shelter tools and kits that help you repair a home that's been damaged so you can shelter in place. And we're going to talk about this specifically as it relates to homes that have been damaged by the shelling in Ukraine. This is a ShelterBox shelter kit. It includes basic things like the tarpaulins, the nails, the rope, the basic tools and fixins to help repair a home that's been damaged or actually create a single room structure like you see here. This is another really essential aid item that enables us to quickly scale a response to serve many families who've been displaced. ShelterBox responds all across the world, and in the past 22 years, we've responded in over 100 countries, over 300 disaster and conflict situations, and we're currently deployed all over the world. The Ukraine crisis was one that we'll talk about today, which has displaced millions. But we are no stranger to some of the world's most challenging and complex conflict situations. ShelterBox has been responding to the crisis in Syria, where half the pre-war population has been displaced. We've been working there for 11 years. It is the reason that ShelterBox in 2018 and 2019 was recognized with really just a few things that really are critical to our work, and it's really just recognition for the work that we're doing in some of the world's most extreme conflict zones. But Syria has been a long-standing piece of our work, and it includes places like some of the most challenging areas of our world where we're working that on the Human Development Index are the poorest places on the planet. Places like the Lake Chad Basin of Africa. We're working in Cameroon. We're working in Nigeria. We're also working in some of the areas with the highest waves of displacement in our world, which includes Burkina Faso, as well as Ethiopia. And then areas right now, there's been conflict situations in Mozambique. We're also responding and finishing a response in Haiti after the earthquake, which devastated parts of the southwestern peninsula in Haiti mid last year in August. So we are deployed all over the world, and we're working in some of these extreme conflict and crisis zones. But I'd like to focus our attention today on Ukraine. This has really captured the attention of the entire world, and for very good reason. The scale and severity of this crisis is immense. What we're seeing already is about a quarter of the population of the country has been displaced, and that's both internally and externally. So the current numbers from UN-OCHA are 12 million people have been displaced. We see 5 million people now who fled to neighboring countries. And then you have over 7 million people who've been internally displaced. And I would say perhaps these are some of the most vulnerable people who are those who have been left behind. And so what you're seeing is a map, and what you're seeing is in red is really kind of the center of gravity for where a lot of the military activity and the Russian military operation has really taken hold. And you see massive waves of displacement as people from eastern Ukraine and northern Ukraine are moving west. And so those blue bubbles that you see are the waves of displacement. It's the number of internally displaced people. So in the western part of Ukraine, you see now about 2.9 million people that have fled towards the area called Lviv. This is an area that ShelterBox has operations staff on the ground. We have local partners that we're working with, and we've begun distributions on projects that we'll share with you today. But there's been a massive amount of internal displacement, and then as many of you have seen on the news headlines, it's been this huge wave of displacement of refugees fleeing to neighboring countries. So you see places like Poland that have received the most in terms of numbers of refugees, and it's approaching 3 million. But then there are some areas that are extraordinarily vulnerable, taking huge amounts of people as a percentage of their population, places like Moldova, also areas like Romania, Hungary. And so you have tens of thousands of families, in many instances, that are fleeing into these countries every single day. And I want to share with you some of the photos from our partners that they have sent. These are photos from eastern and central Ukraine that we've received. As you can see, the military operation, the airstrikes and the shelling have damaged or destroyed thousands of buildings. And so in many of these structures, people have been forced to flee, but also in many of these structures, you have people who are left behind, who need to temporarily repair their structures. And so ShelterBox now has a variety of different projects that we are starting distributions on within Ukraine. I was in the region a month ago. I was in Poland on the Ukraine border, and this is a photo that I took at the Przemysl train station. And this was the first stop for tens of thousands of Ukrainians that were coming across the border every day. 20,000 people came to this train station each and every day. And many of them traveled for days just to get to this point. I met many families who traveled 5+ days by foot, by bus, and by train just to get to this spot. And I'll tell you, they were not necessarily relieved to be there. Many of them had left family members behind. Their families are torn apart. Their livelihoods are in flux. They don't know if their home is still going to be there. And what I saw and really witnessed was mostly women, children, elderly, and disabled. And that's because men between the ages of 18 and 60 are forced to stay back. They have to stay back to fight. And so you saw people leaving with really little more than the clothes on their back, maybe a small roller bag, maybe a backpack on their back with what they could carry out, many pets as well. And really, they weren't necessarily relieved. They were worried about their families. They also were worried about what's going to be the next step for them. And what I also witnessed was an incredible outpouring from the Polish community and citizens and people across the EU, many of them coming to serve as host families for people they've never met before, and really wanting to do anything they could to help these families. But these families are going to really struggle, first with basic needs, a place to sleep, food, water, access to medical care. And right now we're in the early stages of this emergency response. I do think their needs were being very well met, at least when I was there at some of the initial points of call, and that means evacuation centers and then host families. But as these numbers continually increase, and we're now at 12 million displaced, the UN is saying up to 10 million could be externally displaced. A lot of these countries are going to quickly become overwhelmed. And we go from the emergency response phase to more protracted response. And you think about things that eventually these folks will have to get their children enrolled in school. They have to learn languages. They have to work on livelihood, and then potentially midterm settlement in some of these countries. So it is a really complex crisis situation. Many of these families want to go home as soon as they can, but they're not in a situation where they can safely go home. So for many of these families, it's the fear of the unknown. It's the fear of what's happening to their families back home, and their lives have been absolutely ripped apart. So ShelterBox deployed immediately to the region following the beginning of the military operation, which took place on February 24th. We went initially, and what we do is we conduct assessments and we determine really where are people fleeing, what are the basic needs that they have, what are the things that ShelterBox can provide in the immediate aftermath of this situation, what are the longer term needs going to be. But one of the things that we found was we wanted to turn our attention to really the most vulnerable. And we know that the most vulnerable are those families that are stuck in Ukraine. And so with millions of people displaced, we really wanted to focus on helping people who are fleeing to collective centers, people fleeing from east to western Ukraine, many of them, as I mentioned, to Lviv. And so we are partnering with a local NGO in the region called People in Need, and we are providing thousands of mattresses that are going into collective centers. And these are places that people are evacuating to, seeking refuge. Everything from schools, churches, to collective centers where people are gathering, and we're providing these mattresses so people have a bit of comfort, and so people can have a place to sleep and set in lieu of sleeping on the floor. Really critical for people who are in the midst of crisis. In addition, we are partnering on another project within Ukraine with a long-term partner for ShelterBox, which is Relief Aid. And Relief Aid is our partner that we've been working with for years in Syria. They are working in the region right now within central Ukraine, and we're providing our distribution partner with shelter kits. Those are the tarpaulins, the tools, and the fixins that will help repair a home that's been damaged by the bombing and the shelling. So a family can temporarily shelter in place within their home. We are providing thousands of these shelter kits to families, and Relief Aid is going to be conducting these distributions for us. Now, in addition to the shelter kits, we're providing these families with basic household items that are essential as well. Thermal blankets for these families, sleeping mats, hygiene kits so people have access to just a bit of personal care. Also, very, very basic things for families, sleeping mats, I mentioned blankets, solar lanterns, the hygiene kits, but these are going to be essential for these families. So 2 projects right now within Ukraine, and this is going to be helping thousands of people who've been displaced in the aftermath. And what I'm sharing with you now are some of the actual distribution photos and the movement of our materials into the country. So how is this work possible? And I'm moving into what I think will be probably one of the most interesting parts of the webinar, and it's meeting with our response team member on the ground. So as a humanitarian relief organization, we were really founded on the backs of volunteers. And when we got started, we founded a response team program called the ShelterBox Response Team. And it's where we identify and train some of the most highly trained people in all of emergency response. They volunteer and they become response team members. These folks are located all across the world, and they risk their lives and leave their lives behind to do this humanitarian work. And literally, they go in at any stage of a response, from the assessment phase to distributions to monitoring and evaluation, and they help facilitate our response on the ground and ensuring that we're working in the most effective and efficient ways. And as you can see, they get the aid to where they need to go really any way they can. And our work would not be possible without our response team members. On average, 1 in 30 people will make it through the response team program and become a first responder with ShelterBox. So at this point, I would like to introduce you to one of those response team members who is currently stationed in Moldova. She is an extraordinary human being and humanitarian. Katherine Fick is a senior counsel at IBM. That is her day job, leading data privacy and security for that global organization. She is also an adjunct professor at Boston College of Law, where she teaches a course on cybersecurity law and policy. Katherine has served as the board chair of ShelterBox up until December of 2021. She still serves on the executive committee of the board of directors, and she is also an international response team member with ShelterBox. And Katherine has been on several deployments within our organization in Peru, in the Dominican Republic, in Malawi, Paraguay, and Argentina. And Katherine, it's an absolute privilege to welcome you here today. And I want to first by just saying thank you so much for your service to ShelterBox and all the work that you do to enable the life-saving work of the organization.
Thank you, Kerri, and thank you to everyone who's attending today. As you said, Kerri, none of this would be possible without the contributions of our supporters. So everyone who is in that role is playing a role in making a difference in this region to the families that we're serving.
For sure. Katherine, can you describe where you are today and why you are there? I know you're in Moldova, but maybe how you got there, where you are, and why you're focusing on Moldova.
Sure, thanks, Kerri. So we're right now, I'm with another member of the emergency response team for ShelterBox. We are in Moldova's capital, Chisinau, and we're in Moldova because Moldova, as you can see from the map that is helpfully on the screen right now, is surrounded on 3 of its borders by Ukraine and then on another by Romania. And as you mentioned, Kerri, Moldova has been taking in the highest proportion of refugees from Ukraine vis-a-vis its population. It's a small country. It's it's one of the poorest countries in Europe. When we drove in, Moldova's airspace has been closed because of the conflict. And so our driver met me in Romania on a border city there where I flew in. And when we drove into the capital, which takes about 3.5 hours, we passed a number of people in wooden carts. You know, Moldova's economy is based on agriculture. They actually have a large winemaking part of their economy as well. So most of the people in the country are farmers or involved in that industry in some way. And so Moldova is also not part of the EU, so it doesn't have EU level resources like Poland or Romania or some of the other countries that do. So when refugees come in, the government of Moldova has been doing an amazing job of accommodating them, but they also don't have the same level of resources that an EU country would. So the majority of refugees who've been coming in from Ukraine to Moldova have continued to pass through the country. But of those who have stayed in Moldova, over 90% are staying in private homes. There are some collective centers where people are living in, for example, a large auditorium, but by and large, they're with private families. And so the government has set up programs to provide monetary assistance to those families and also to the individual refugees who are staying in Moldova for a longer period of time. And that's where ShelterBox is coming in to help.
Mm-hmm. So, Katherine, I know a lot of people are coming across into Moldova and they're winding up at, this is what we're looking at here, is a reception center. And
Right.
so from here, they're either going with host families or they're staying in collective centers. And I know that, you know, obviously these centers are quickly becoming filled up and could quickly become overwhelmed. So I guess when you look at the ways that ShelterBox can be helpful, can you share anything about how we're working to understand the needs of people fleeing to neighboring countries like Moldova and how we're kind of assessing what those might be and how we're mobilizing and organizing around those?
That's right. So as you mentioned, Kerri, ShelterBox focuses on meeting the needs of the most vulnerable members of the population, and certainly those who are fleeing Ukraine are generally, as you had seen firsthand in Poland, older people or women with young children. And in the case of people who are coming into Moldova, because they tend to be moving through the country, handing them a shelter kit would not make sense, right? They also using a shelter kit in Moldova, given that the conflict is not in Moldova, would not be reasonable either. What is helpful and what ShelterBox is looking at doing is providing them with a small amount of cash, which will help them as they continue their journey and will also give them the dignity of being able to choose how best to allocate that as they look at basically this horrible and unexpected situation that they're in, and they need to figure out how to best protect their families in this situation, and they're not sure how long they'll need to be away from home for. We're also looking at providing hygiene kits, which provide the kinds of things like toothpaste and soap that we might need, anyone would need, if you had to leave home quickly and didn't have time to pack those sorts of things. So that's something else that we'll be distributing in Moldova with an eye toward the fact that people need things that are portable, and they also need things that are practical, and they need flexibility to determine how best, what kinds of resources will best help their family given what they're facing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I want to share, and thank you, Katherine, I want to share one of those families, and one of our colleagues sent this photo of Oksana and her children who fled from Ukraine into Moldova into one of the collective centers, and they were forced to leave her husband, their father, behind. And her top priority is trying to get home to them when it's safe. But the question mark is kind of when and if it's going to be safe for them to go back in the near term. So I guess when you look at our work at this stage, Katherine, what do you see as kind of the major challenges that organizations are confronting right now within the region, and maybe even in Ukraine that you're hearing about from the team that you're working with in the region?
Uncertainty is probably at the top of that list, right? People who are leaving Ukraine now had hoped that they would not need to leave Ukraine. And we can see, because of the developing situation, why they would now make the decision to leave. And as you said too, a lot of people want to return home as soon as they can, right? As any of us would as well. So that uncertainty means that ShelterBox and other aid organizations who are working in the region are trying to adapt to the changing environment and really the changing needs of the people who are fleeing and how we can best help. Because this isn't a situation where any of us know how this is going to turn out and how long the crisis will be ongoing for. So we want to be agile and able to respond in ways that will best help the families who are in need.
Mhm. Great. Can you maybe share a little bit more? I know that when you deploy, you're there for a series of weeks. Can you tell us what a typical day is like and what some of the work that you're going to be focused on? And maybe even if you can share anything that our folks in Ukraine are currently doing with partners who are in training, that might be helpful as well. And more broadly, as a response team member, what are some of the roles that you serve in when you go to these disaster and conflict zones?
Sure, sure. And I'll speak on behalf of the full team. So these are not roles that I personally have had in this particular response. What we're currently focusing on is negotiating an agreement with a large partner of ShelterBox that will help us be able to provide that cash. And what we're looking at is doing that on a short-term basis because the UN is rolling out a broader platform that will be used to provide cash to refugees over a longer amount of time, looking at the disaster as something that will be ongoing. So we're providing a shorter term response in that particular context. So we're working on the terms of that agreement and at most immediately. Things that other members of the team, of our response teams do and have done in the context of this response is meet with government officials, which is what ShelterBox did when we were initially in Moldova, to find out how we can best help, as opposed to just showing up and starting to hand out aid without bothering to find out what the government is doing, what other NGOs are doing, and how we can best fit in. So that's a key part of what we're doing. In Ukraine itself, the team who is there has been working with, as you mentioned, the partners on the ground to both help to scope the response, given the very, very fragile situation there and the fact that they are responding in real time to the developing threats and situations in that region too. So they're working directly with those partners. I should take a step back and explain the partner role, which is critical for ShelterBox. And it's critical if we all think about this in our own lives, we get to make a lot more impact when we're working effectively with other organizations. And that's something that ShelterBox really focuses on doing so that we can have the greatest impact to the families we all want to serve.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I always say that we never go it alone. There's many amazing humanitarian organizations who are working alongside us, and we get to the privilege of working with so many great organizations, and many of them are risking their lives to help distribute this aid and help do this work with ShelterBox. I want to be mindful, Katherine, of some of the questions we're receiving, so I want to pose a few of those to you. How is what you're seeing inside and outside the area different from what ShelterBox sees in other conflict and disaster responses?
Yeah, so I can speak to disaster responses because this is the first conflict response I have deployed to. The others have all been natural disasters, so that's quite different. Where what you are seeing is a level of pain and a different kind of pain on the part of the people that we're working with. Mm-hmm. Certainly, as far as other conflicts go, the fact that this is unfolding in unpredictable ways is a differentiator from some of the others I've been familiar with. We're not sure of how this will be going, which is always the case, and certainly the case with natural disasters too. But it's particularly acute in this response.
Mm-hmm. I think, and that leads to the second question, which is how does ShelterBox really see the needs of displaced individuals changing over time, and how long might we anticipate responding in a situation like what's happening within Ukraine?
Yeah. I mean, none of us are able to speak to that definitively. What we can say is that as you alluded to earlier, the people who have fled want to return home, right? And so the question is when that will be safe and a good plan for them. And then when that happens, what will ShelterBox's role be in helping to provide a bridge as they look to reconstruct their homes? Certainly our shelter is well positioned for that in many cases, but there are a lot of variables that will go into those considerations that we'll all be looking forward to considering as this moves forward.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So Katherine, about you, you work for an extraordinary organization, I know, IBM, and they lend you out, right, to go out and do this work. How has your role as a privacy attorney really helped you for maybe the role that you're doing right now? Is there some transfer of professional skills there?
Actually, yes, there have been. In reviewing the nature of the work that we're doing here, and this, I want to be really careful. I am not representing, ShelterBox in a legal capacity, and IBM is my employer, but they're not sponsoring this either. They are certainly supporting me here, and I want to thank them for that. But they are not in charge of this response, so I don't want to avoid any issues there. But yes, the privacy and cybersecurity work that I do in my day job has become directly relevant to this response because there are data, refugees will be providing some level of personal data to the partners that we're working with so that their payments can be processed. And so how that information is secured and what information is gathered and making sure that we're aligning with applicable data regulations, as well as just the practical needs of protecting this information so that the refugees are able to focus on what they need to focus on and not worry about things like downstream handling of their data. That's something that we've been able to bring to this conversation more generally, and working with the partner who will be, ShelterBox is not going to be directly handling the data, but we've been able to provide some insights to the partner to help them better scope what they're going to be doing from a protection and privacy standpoint.
Sure. Wow. And Katherine, obviously you're very busy as a privacy attorney and also an adjunct professor of law at Boston College, and then service on boards and obviously as a response team member. What makes this work so compelling that you would drop everything and leave your life behind and risk your life and kind of do double duty while you're there? I'm sure, I know you're working half the time for IBM and a lot of the time for ShelterBox, but why? Why do you do this?
It's the same reason, Kerri, why you do it, right? And why we have people who are joining us and taking time out of their day to catch up on what's happening. We are all seeing these images and we all want to do something to help. And so there are so many different ways that we each can help. People, and I'm not kidding when I go back to the supporter issue, right? If people who support the work of this organization are directly helping, it makes a big difference. And so that is the reason, right? We don't want to just sit back and passively consume all of this information about what's happening in this region. We want to do something about it. And so ShelterBox provides all kinds of ways to do that, whether it's getting involved with the ambassador program, whether it's supporting the organization financially, or volunteering with a local Rotary club to help promote ShelterBox's work. Each of us have ways that we can pitch in. And given what's happening, I think we're all in agreement that this is at the top of our priority list, because our hearts are really with the people who are impacted by this situation.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I know that doing this work it can be immense and incredibly complex. I always look for the little wins along the way. I know when I was in Poland on the border of Ukraine, I met a woman from France who had traveled dozens of hours to take in 4 girls she'd never met before and serve as a host family. And I often feel that sometimes in the worst of times, you see the best of humanity and the best of people coming together. Any little wins that you've experienced since you've been there that just give you a lot of hope?
Yeah. I mean, the best little win is just what the people of Moldova are doing collectively to support the refugees who are coming in. This is not a country, as I mentioned before, with a lot of resources. This is a country, that is agrarian, that is modest, and yet they are opening up their homes to strangers who are coming in and fleeing these circumstances. That is amazing, and it's wonderful to see that kind of insistence on hospitality and warmth and love. Particularly right now, the people in Moldova and in Ukraine are leading up to Orthodox Easter, and so seeing that kind of insistence on that spirit of hope in spite of all that's going on is really wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Great. I saw that too with the Polish people as well, and it definitely feels that warmth of coming together and people wanting to do anything they can in the worst of times. One final question for you, Katherine, and I know you have a lot of work to do there, but one question that's come in is, Katherine, thank you so much for your great efforts. Beyond the cash assistance, what other types of assistance do you envision ShelterBox providing in Moldova? Very different types of aid than what we're seeing ShelterBox providing in Ukraine.
Yes. Yeah, so that's a great question. And we are tailoring the aid. So hygiene kits is the other category that I mentioned, which based on the needs assessment that we've done, it seems to be at the top of the list because people either, I'm sure people have seen the photographs, right? Those who are fleeing have a, maybe a suitcase, maybe a backpack, not a lot of stuff with them. And so a hygiene kit helps to supplement that if you've already used up your toothpaste or if you didn't bring any because you were leaving in the middle of the night or whatever the circumstances, right? So that is at the top of the list. And we'll continue to monitor that, right? And to see what makes sense, which is what ShelterBox does everywhere we respond around the world, how we can best respond. The mattresses in Lviv that are being provided is another great example, right? Of suddenly there are collective centers with a lot of people in them. And so mattresses make that a lot more comfortable if you're there for a longer term than you would want to be otherwise. So that's another example of something that usually we don't provide, but we are providing it in these circumstances.
Yeah, so the importance of really that nimbleness and flexibility in the approach. And I often say that, we really tailor the response and customize the aid to meet the unique needs of each disaster, and it's always different. So Katherine, another and final question for you is, what's the most efficient way to donate to support ShelterBox response right now in Ukraine? Is it items? Is it donations? What do we need?
Yeah, so donations online would be the best, and you can let me know if there's a better way, but that's the best. Items, unfortunately, so this bit of context may help. It's wonderful that people have the impulse to donate items, but I would focus that on your local organizations that may be providing items to refugees coming into the country more generally, because ShelterBox, when we ship in items, we're trying to meet, it's easier for us to be able to get things into customs if we're meeting humanitarian standards for the items themselves. And so that means that we're not usually able to provide, items that are donated that are not donated in, quantities of thousands, for example. So that's a wonderful impulse, but it's best used within the country as opposed to shipping it because of the way that we provide international aid.
Okay, that's helpful. And on our website at shelterboxusa.org, there are ways to make a financial contribution. Also, if you're interested in learning more about the program Katherine's part of, which is the ShelterBox Response Team program, or other volunteer opportunities. So,
yeah, the ambassador program too, right, is a great way to get involved as well. So that's another opportunity.
Mm-hmm. I promised one more, but I'm gonna give you one more because it's a mention of Rotary.
Sure.
Have we been in communication with Rotary in the region, and are we coordinating with them at all?
Yes, so we are, and I'll provide this context for everyone who hasn't heard me provide it before. Rotary is key to our responses around the world. In Moldova, we have been working with Rotarians in the capital, and they introduced ShelterBox to the government agency that ultimately introduced us to the partner we're working with. That was key in helping to find out the most efficient way to help. Because again, we don't want to just show up in a country and start handing out aid without bothering to find out what's needed and find out what's already happening so that we're not duplicating efforts or missing a gap. And our Rotarians in Moldova were amazing at making that introduction. I'll say too, Rotarians in my personal experience made all the difference in Peru. There they introduced us to the first lady of the country at the time through a personal connection that the Rotarian happened to have, and she was able to get us in with the emergency management equivalent in Peru. So they make a difference. Rotarians make a difference around the world in helping our responses, and it's great to work with them.
Great. Okay, Katherine, thank you so much for your service to ShelterBox, and thank you for being on the ground in Moldova and helping to coordinate the response there. I look forward to hearing more about the work and how we are evolving the response there to help thousands of people who've come across. So thank you, Katherine. I will let you leave us now, and I am going to turn our attention from our work in the Ukraine crisis to now focusing on another crisis that ShelterBox has been actively distributing in. It's one of the world's most complex crisis zones in today, and it's not making the headlines. And as many of you know, I always say if it bleeds, it leads, and it's on the worst day ever when something really garners the media headlines that people are really aware of these vexing issues that are plaguing our world, like you're seeing in Ukraine. But so much of the work of ShelterBox never makes the headlines, and the work is truly life-saving to these families. And so I want to share, because it is so recent, our distributions that we're just finishing up in Yemen. And Yemen, as you can see there, sits right there. You see Saudi Arabia sitting to the north and Oman sitting to the northeast of Yemen. This has been an area that's been absolutely plagued by conflict. It's 7 years of armed conflict in Yemen, which has caused tens of thousands of casualties and millions of people to be displaced. In 2019, right before this whole crisis with COVID started, the UN called Yemen the worst humanitarian crisis with the most people in need of humanitarian assistance in the world. And it's really startling. Right now, what you see is 85% of the population of Yemen in need of humanitarian assistance. It is one of the lowest countries on the Human Development Index, and there are 24 million people in need and just about 13 million people in acute need. And many of these are children, both girls and boys. And what we do know as well is that the center of gravity for displacement is the area where ShelterBox is working, and it's in that dark blue area called Marib. And Marib hosts one of the largest IDP populations within Yemen. It's 1 million people who've been displaced 2 years or longer within that region. And the country is one that is prone and host to a whole bunch of different problems. One, you have natural hazards, which are really aggravating the crisis. You have flooding, you have drought situations, you have temperatures consistently rising in this area. And so you have one of the most water-stressed countries in the world. You've got severe food and water shortages, which are contributing to a famine there. You have health issues. There's over 50% of the healthcare has been impacted, and only 50% have functional healthcare facilities within the country. So you've got health issues, you've got water and sanitation needs, and you have a massive amount of displacement. And so this is an area that we knew at ShelterBox we absolutely had to turn our attention to, one of the most vulnerable countries in the world. And so we began a project this year. And I want to say a really big thank you to several of our partners who quietly supported this work. It includes LDSC, it includes the Crystal Springs Foundation, as well as Rotary, who really felt that while this wasn't making the headlines, right, and Ukraine and COVID has been dominating the headlines, we really wanted to step up and do something. And so we received support for a project to help 1,350 families within the region. And as you can see, the shelters here are very austere. It's really what any materials that these families can cobble together. You see some basic plastic and maybe some tarpaulins, some basic fabric, some sticks. So we really wanted to do what we could to help really bring emergency shelter and basic household supplies to these families. One of those families, and we identified first a partner within the region doing extraordinary work in Marib, and that's BCHR, and that's Benevolence Coalition for Humanitarian Relief. It's a nonprofit organization working across a range of sectors, providing basic things, food, shelter, basic humanitarian items that are essential for life. They've done about 20 different projects in the region, and with BCHR, we conducted assessments to determine the most vulnerable and what the needs were going to be. And within those assessments, and that's the first step of the response, is always conducting the assessments. They met with Ezrak, and she lives in Marib in Yemen. She lives with her family of 5. And what she said was, when the rains and the floods came to the region, they lost absolutely everything. Their house was totally destroyed. She said everything was gone. All of her household items were gone, the refrigerator, the oven, even all of my children's clothes remained, nothing. And she said, we are suffering right now. There isn't a place for us to sleep. And as a result, we sleep outside in the yard. We're so tired and poor. We had just one room for my husband and children, and now we have nothing. So Ezrak is really indicative of the types of people and families that we work to find at ShelterBox, the most vulnerable families who just need the basic building blocks for recovery. And we know that's what shelter provides to these families. So they identified Ezrak and they asked her, what's the difference that the shelter aid is going to support to make your concerns better? And she said, I can live a happy life with dignity and safety with my family if we could just access a shelter. And she is one of the families that's been targeted in these distributions that just completed in Yemen. As you can see, I'm showing you some photos with our partner BCHR. And what you see here are basic things. These are shelter kits. So these are tarpaulins that you see here, as well as we're providing our fabric UN family style tents to these families. So there's a variety of aid packages, which includes tents, tarpaulins. We're also including kitchen sets as well. We know from these deployments that some of the most valued items that we deploy are kitchen sets. Really cooking a hot meal, sitting down and sharing a meal restores a sense of routine and normalcy for these families. So the cook sets we deploy as well. We're also bringing these thermal blankets that you see here and sleeping mats, as well as hygiene supplies to help really protect against COVID. So masks, gloves, sanitizers, water purification units that you see here, as well as the solar lanterns. Now, a big part of the work of ShelterBox is really in the teaching and training and capacity building that we're doing with our partners and the beneficiaries we serve. And despite the challenges of COVID, this remains absolutely instrumental to our work. And so I wanted to share with you some of the photos of the trainings that have been going on with BCHR, our partner on the ground, and also the beneficiaries on how to construct the shelters, also how to utilize the aid items. And as you can see, this is a picture of a community that has just been trained on the aid items. But all told, it's 1,350 families that have received the comprehensive shelter and then the other household aid packages within the region. Finally, I think, what I'd like to share is that at ShelterBox, we always focus on the most vulnerable. And those tend to be women, they tend to be children, they tend to be elderly, and they also tend to be disabled. And, the hardest decision that we have to make at the organization is saying that there's not enough aid. We are a small but very nimble organization. We're doing absolutely everything that we can to help in some of the world's most extreme conflict zones. That includes right now Ukraine, and it also includes places like Yemen. But our work continues all over the world, and so much of our work never makes the headlines. Our work in Burkina Faso, where I mentioned has the highest waves of displacement, Syria, Nigeria, Mozambique, and all of this work is only made possible because of the private charitable support of so many people who learn about the organization and they step up to serve. And that's either as a volunteer, they make a financial contribution, and they give to enable this life-saving work. And many of you have supported the Ukraine crisis, and I know that's why you've come here today to learn more about our work there. But we want to say so much a big thank you to all of you for caring about people that you may never meet in your lifetime, but whose lives you are transforming through the work of ShelterBox, and we couldn't do it without you. We're just getting started, as you heard in the Ukraine response. We've got 3 different projects, 2 within Ukraine, 1 in the neighboring countries. And yes, I know many of you asked, will we continue to look at other neighboring countries as well? And the answer is yes. And we're starting with these first 3, but we believe that this is going to be moving into a protracted conflict situation. The needs will shift and change over time. And we remain committed to helping these families, much like we've helped families in some other extreme conflict zones, like I mentioned, even in Syria. I certainly hope that this is not a conflict that goes on for a decade or longer, but we do know that it looks to be like it will go on for several months, if not longer. And these families, especially within Ukraine, are going to need our help. So a big thank you to everyone. I'm going to see if we have any other questions before we leave you. Okay, we have a few more. Okay. Can you give any more detail on the hygiene kits, what's included? Yes, so as Katherine were mentioning, hygiene supplies are really crucial for families to maintain a bit of personal care and hygiene, some dignity to take care of themselves. So it's basic things like oral care, it's toothbrushes, it's toothpaste, it could be basic things like laundry detergent, a hairbrush, nail clippers, very basic things to maintain some personal hygiene in these really extraordinary situations. So hygiene items are a component of our work. It is something that's relatively new for us. We are going to be providing them in places like Moldova, but we've also really expanded our work over the past 2 years to include other essential items to help mitigate the spread of COVID-19. And so we are seeing in many of our responses around the world things like masks, gloves, sanitizers, basic things for people to protect their families. Okay, let's see. Is COVID-19 impacting our responses? Certainly they are, and I think every humanitarian organization and every person's been impacted by COVID over the past few years. So yes, we are doing things to keep people safe, but COVID does exist. It's something we have to be very cautious and very concerned about, particularly in places like what we're seeing right now in Ukraine. And so the teams are being very careful, but it is definitely a concern for sure. Thank you so much for all of you for participating today. I know there's several other questions that have come in, and I think we'll try to answer many of those offline as well, but a big thank you. And for more information on how you can participate with the organization, you can follow the response in Ukraine, or you can get involved with the organization. You can go to shelterboxusa.org. There are ways to make a donation, there are ways to learn about the response team program, and many ways to volunteer. So thank you so much for your time and attention today, and we will continue to keep you posted on the response in Ukraine as well as our responses around the world. So thank you.